All right, then. It's just turned 4 o'clock here in the UK where I am based. So that means it is time for the Trinity College London Transformative Teachers webinar for February 2026. So, welcome everybody. My name is Simon Dunton, and it's really great to welcome such an international body of peers with us today. I think we've hit pretty much every continent looking at the chat box already, with countries including Italy, Spain, Ireland, China, Egypt, Myanmar, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Uruguay. I think we've pretty much got peers joining us from around the globe today. But they're not here to listen to me, of course. So just before I introduce us or introduce you to our speaker today, a short reminder for those that have been before and to let people that haven't of how this will work today. We're going to be here for about an hour with our speaker delivering a talk for about 45 to 50 minutes. So there will be time for questions and answers at the end. As you know, this is being recorded and you'll get a copy of that recording emailed to you. And eventually it will make its way to the Trinity College London website as well. Do play around with your view so you can see the chat box and that you're comfortable with all of the settings that you have. I think this will be quite an interactive session. There are some questions for you to answer, and you can see the chat is moving really quickly there, which is fantastic. Which means if you do have questions for our speaker today, it might be better to use the Q&A or the question tool that you'll find somewhere on your screen so that your question doesn't get lost. And we will do our best to answer all of those questions or ask all of those questions to our speaker at the end of today's session. And the all-important piece of news, you will all automatically receive a report of attendance that will be sent via your email within about a week or 10 days of today. So that leads me to introduce our speaker for today, who is, as you all know, Dylan Gates. Now, Dylan is a highly experienced business English trainer and teacher, and he's based in Spain. He's had many roles in the ELT world, with managerial roles, assessment roles, training roles, materials writing, and as he says, he specializes in pragmatic, learner-centered approaches like Dogme, and that informs his passion for simple, low prep and purpose-driven activity design, which is all fantastic news to my ears. Now he's here today to talk about structuring activities around professional needs. So without further ado, I will hand over and welcome Dylan.
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me okay? I hope so. And thank you as well. I'm really, really happy because I was watching the number of people, the participants, and I thought, is it going to reach 200? And it's reached 204. So that's great that all of you have decided to spend some time with us at Trinity today. So if I can just share my screen. As Simon said, I'm going to be talking about from needs analysis to lesson design, structuring activities around professional needs. So just a couple of things before we begin. This is what I'm going to talk about. A bit about English for professional purposes nowadays, spoken communication needs, and needs analysis, your best resource. I've got a framework to give you, which you might like to use at some point or experiment with or adapt for activity and lesson designs. And then hopefully we'll have time at the end for a Q&A. Now, there are obviously many terms we can use, but I quite like the term English for professional purposes, which is a strand of ESP, English for specific purposes. Some people might call it English for occupational purposes. Some people might call it business English, although that's, again, a type of professional purposes field. And that's what I've been working in mainly for quite a long time now. And I guess I really started with business English, as we used to call it back then, in around 2006. I had done some before, but this was really when I started to do a lot of business English training. And back in those days, it was very different. We really focused on presentations, giving formal presentations, in-person presentations. We also looked at businesses in meetings in in-person meetings, like the one you see in the picture. And our resource was generally a course book, like In Company, Business Matters, these sort of books. If we fast forward 20 years, things are very different. Now, of course, you might give online presentations like I'm doing at the moment, possibly to tens or hundreds of people. Meetings themselves, they're no longer just sitting down meeting. You might work in a company where you have stand-up meetings where people are much more engaged and active. And of course, resources have completely changed. I've got Duolingo there, but AI is the big thing. By the way, I'm not really going to talk about AI today. I'll probably mention it a couple of times, but I found that in the last year, almost every webinar I've attended has been about AI. So I'm not going to focus so much on that, if that's okay. Okay, so things have changed and we've got to be responsive to these changes. Now, I was thinking about how I work with EPP, English for professional purposes, especially in the field of oral communication, because most of my learners, most of my professional clients, that's what they want. They want to improve their ability to speak and interact in English. And so we have a few terms here that I'd like to just look at quickly. Feel free to write in the chat, what do I mean by BELF? Does anyone know? Is anyone familiar with that term? So again, if you want to, please write your answers in the chat. Yep. Timothy, hi Timothy, you've jumped straight in there. Business English as a lingua franca. Fantastic. Yeah. So we have English as a lingua franca and now business English as a lingua franca, although some people prefer it as English as a business lingua franca. So, and just today, or yesterday, I should say, I was speaking to a client of mine who's Italian. And he said that he had a meeting in Milan last week with his Spanish counterparts, Italian, Spanish, kind of similar languages, and they did the whole meeting in English. Okay. And interestingly, he said, Dylan, I was thinking of you during the meeting because we were talking about the resume at the end. And I remember that you told me in English, as a native speaker, I would say a summary. But he said, well, it didn't really matter. We all understood that actually we were talking about a summary. So you see, the language is also changing and adapting to business English as a lingua franca, where people use English even though they don't speak English as their mother tongue. Now, also, I talked earlier about presentations and meetings. Presentation is often a spoken production mode. It's a monologue, basically. But many of our learners, they have to interact in English, have dialogues, and also in so many meetings now, they will have to give a little mini monologue, a mini presentation of 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes, like an update. So they're moving from spoken production to spoken interaction, back to production, back to interaction all the time. So they've got to be really flexible with those two modes. And finally, CAF. What does that normally refer to? Again, if you want to write in the chat, CAF. We often use it when we refer to speaking, specifically assessment. Okay, lots of, yeah, right. This is the debate at the moment. Originally, I always knew it as complexity, accuracy, and fluency. But my question to everyone now is, if you're working with English as your professional language, perhaps clarity is much more important than complexity. So if you want, you tell me, which do you think is most important when we use English as a professional language? At work, for example, English for professional purposes, would you say clarity or complexity is more important? Okay. Yeah. Clarity trumps every time. Or I don't like to hear that word trump. I hear that word trump all the time. So yeah. But yes, you're right. Okay. Okay, great. Just something to think about. Now, whenever you work in ESP, English for specific purposes, whether that's English for occupational purposes, English for aviation purposes, whatever it is, a needs analysis, I think most people will agree, is really, really important. So again, I want you to think about working with professionals. And if you could in the chat, just write down your answers to those questions. What is a needs analysis? And what is the purpose of a needs analysis? Okay, so I'll give you maybe a minute to think about that. Right, analyzing students' need, baseline data to plan, communication struggles. Okay. Oh, Yamin here, yours is very similar to mine, actually. Almost exactly the same. You're reading my mind. Okay. Needs, aspirations, fantastic. To make sure that the training will fit what the learner needs and does in English, and the purpose is to not waste their time. I love that. That's fantastic. The real goal, yeah, where they are, where they want to be, lacks, need. Great, fantastic. Now, of course, we'll all have our own answer to this question, but I spent some time thinking about it and I came up with it's a dynamic and ongoing process that focuses on the learner, the language, and the context. Now, when I started doing business English training or English for professional purposes back 20 years ago or so, I would have seen it as a product, a document that I had at the beginning of the course, and then I referred to it throughout the course. Now I don't really see it as a product. I see it much more as a process, something that's evolving, emerging, changing all the time, and is kind of co-constructed with the learner. The purpose, this is what I've got. Identifying and narrowing the gap between the learner's current performance and the performance needed to do their job effectively. So, as someone said, we don't want to waste their time. It might be that the needs analysis reveals that actually they're perfectly capable of doing their job effectively in English, in which case they may not need our help. Okay. Just one thing about the idea of gap. It may be a linguistic gap, of course. It may be a communicative gap. It may be a gap in terms of intercultural communication. It might be a knowledge gap. It might be a skills gap. It might be a motivation gap. Could be lots of different gaps. So that's also quite useful to know. Confidence gaps. Yeah, exactly. Great. And yes, what do they actually need to do in English at work? We've always got to focus on that. But before I look at that, again, if you agree that we need to know about the learner, the language, their language, and also the language they might need to use, and the context. Again, if you could just put your ideas in the chat, you know, be specific. What exactly do we need to know about those different things? So again, I'll give you, oh, sorry. Preferences, other languages they speak, great, yeah. Typology, yeah. Right, incentives or again, motivation incentives, yeah. Challenges, processes, okay. Concerns, yeah, that's really important. Intrinsic, extrinsic motivation. Yeah, exactly. Maybe they don't really want to attend these English training sessions, but they're being told to by stakeholders. Yeah. Goals, absolutely. Great. Strengths and weaknesses, fantastic. Yeah, absolutely. All of these things are really important. Okay. Now, there are lots of formal documents and lots of studies and lots of papers and lots of books about needs analysis. This one I thought was quite interesting from Bocanegra Valley. Six types of sub-analysis. So we have the needs analysis and target situation, the discourse they need to use. If they're working in a factory, the English they might use might be very different to working, for example, in a corporate boardroom. Um, Maybe they're working in finance, very different to someone working in IT. Present situation, the learner factors, motivation, teaching context, that's for us, and the task analysis. So it fits in, I think, with the language, the learner, and the context. But I would also say that something like this, the language, the learner, the context, it's quite macro level in that we're looking from above at the learner, and it's quite general, quite global. And yet, sometimes we really need to zoom in and think about the communicative events that our learners participate in every day at work. Okay, so it's great knowing about motivation, their learning habits, everything like that. But we need to really think about these specific communicative situations in meetings, when they're attending conferences, in sales calls, all of these things, in project management update meetings. And so that's really the key question, you know, in their real world communicative context, what exactly do they need to do in English? Okay. So if you want, again, if you want to use the chat box and just maybe share some of your ideas about what specific communicative needs our learners might have. Someone's got a question. Laura's raised her hand. Okay. I don't know if there's a question there. Okay. Negotiation skills, functional language, conveying clear message. Great. Being understood. Small talk. Yeah. Great. Communicate with the team based in the United States. Exactly. So it might be, they might have to speak with so-called native speakers or non-native speakers. Yeah. Okay. Fantastic. Thanks for sharing. Legal department, tonality. Yeah. Great. Okay. So again, I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience here, but I was thinking I'd really like a very simple needs analysis that I could use on a regular basis before my meetings with my clients or my groups. But as I said, it's a process. So something that I can use over and over and over again. And, you know, I can even do it at the start of a lesson, you know, in 2 or 3 minutes, maybe. And I found this from John Hughes in a book, I think it's called ETpedia Business English Skills or Training or Ideas. I can't remember exactly. But it was, we need to know, what do our learners communicate about, topics, the specialities, etc., who they communicate with, and how do they communicate? Okay. Is it by phone, Skype? It's a bit old that, probably MS Teams nowadays, face to face, email, all of those things. So I think number three, the answer won't necessarily change that often for a lot of learners. But this idea of what, who, how. But I think something's missing. So again, if you want to try to answer that question, okay, someone said, what do you want to achieve? Outcome. That's it. ETpedia Business English. That's the one. Objectives, purpose. Okay, register. Okay, I guess register perhaps with number two, we might have an idea. Okay, objectives. Yeah, language. I mean, it might be that they're actually using more than one language and the stakes. Okay, I like that. Yeah. Okay. Okay, now I thought I wanted to make it as simple as possible. So, what, who, how, and a few people have already said it. It's the why, the purpose. You may be familiar with Simon Sinek, and he always says, starts with the why, the idea that we need to find out the purpose of any action. So, what's the desired outcome or communicative intent? And this brings us on to really functional language. So, are they trying to persuade a client? Are they trying to persuade their boss to extend a deadline? Are they trying to defend their decision? Are they apologizing for the mistake? Is it just informational? So we can really focus on the purpose, and our learners should be able to tell us that, I think. We might have to ask them a few questions, but we want that information to come from them. So we're really working with their specific communicative needs. And if you go to the CEFR, this is also a useful category, which is macro functions of oral production. And in the CEFR Common European Framework of References for Language, this is from the 2008 edition, they talk about interpersonal communication, small talk, social conversation, evaluative, so discussion and goal orientated, like problem solving, and then transactional, like exchanging information, interviews, lots of telecommunication, team briefings, all of these sort of things. So I would like you to try to rank them. When you work with your learners, which do you think is the most important for them? Which do you think is the next most important? And which do you think is the least important? So, one, two, three. Transactional, evaluative, interpersonal. Okay, evaluative. Great. Someone said at the start, interpersonal. Yeah, it might be that we start with the interpersonal and that gives them the confidence to move on to maybe more complex things like evaluative or transactional talk. Great. And this is a really simple activity you could do with your learners. Okay. Get them thinking about it, and then you could plan your activities and lessons based on what they find most difficult. Great. Okay. So, as I said, we've got this the what, sorry, the what is basically the topic. So I'd like to, this is taken from a learner I had a while ago, and I asked him to do this type of needs analysis. And this is what he came up with. And then I asked about the who, his audience, and this is what he came up with. And then it was the how. And then finally, I asked them about the why. Okay. Now, of course, you could do something like this. You could ask them to write, or you could actually have a conversation, but it's a very simple needs analysis. I think you can do at the beginning of a course or even on a regular basis throughout the course. Okay. Now, I want you to look at the information from that needs analysis and try to extract things that he said that could be the basis for activities or even lessons. So, for example, he said he needs to talk about my daily task. That could be an idea for a single lesson. But actually, if you go through those four different answers, there's plenty of ideas. So again, if you want to write in the chat, just some of the things you might want to focus on. Okay, so someone said idioms. Yeah, that was in the Who. Okay, I'd also like you to think about, yeah, something like accents is a good idea, but there's a lot, they would need a lot of work to really help them with that. So maybe if you can think about what could be the basis for a small activity or even a single lesson. Language of persuasion. Okay. Okay. Great. Okay. So this is what I identified. So in the Who section, even something like explaining why we're late, explaining, that could be just a great little activity. Why we need more money, asking for budget extensions or budget expansions. With the Who. Okay. Speaking very fast, that would probably require a lot of work. It might almost be more useful for them to learn how to ask their bosses how to speak a little slower. Okay. There we have register, maybe sounding more professional. With the how, we have plenty of ideas there. Maybe we have a face-to-face meeting with the learner or a lesson with the learner. And maybe you might say, well, let's do an MS Teams meeting instead. So it's more authentic, more realistic. Interrupting. Okay. And then with the why, as people said, convincing people, persuading people, I need to learn how to say, we must do this. So more forceful language. Maybe they're being too polite and they have to learn how to be more direct while also being diplomatic. Okay. Avoid, yeah, great. There's some great ideas as well in the chat. Avoidance of ambiguity. Yeah. I mean, this with the big bosses, maybe they're native speakers and they use all this idiomatic language. Maybe they need to know that that's not working as well. Remember, communication goes both ways. So you can see that something like the what, who, how, and why needs analysis could reveal so much information about what our learners really need in their daily communication. But again, there is another problem. Most of us as trainers, we don't have the option of sitting in on these meetings and listening to our learners use English in their specific work context. So we're guessing a lot. And that's one of the problems I think with a lot of course books is that they present a very generic type of language, which may not actually be used in our learners' meetings, if they're project managers or if they're IT specialists or whatever it is. So how do you know what language is used in your learners' work context? Oksana said include an SME, a subject matter expert. Absolutely. That's great. But also, in my experience, a lot of the time, these people aren't available. So perhaps the next best thing. Oh, sorry. Okay. That's a good idea, getting the learners to record maybe a meeting. But I come back to this, and this is something that a director of studies said to me 20, 25 years ago. He observed one of my classes, and I had loads of fantastic resources, but I spent all the time on the materials, and I didn't really give the learners that much chance to actually communicate. And he said, Dylan, remember, the learners are your best resource. And so I looked a little bit through the literature on ESP and EOP. And I found this great article by Hyland English for specific purposes. What is it and where is it taking us? ESP today. And I've summarized this or I've paraphrased this in my own way, but he talks about student expertise. You know, your students are the expert in their job. Just talking about their job is a really useful activity for them, but they can tell you. Authenticity check. They know what really happens at work. Often I find myself introducing an idiom and saying, this is how we would say it. It would be fantastic. And they tell me, in my work context, nobody really uses idioms because we're all, we speak English as a second or third language. We're much more kind of direct and informational. So they know, they have an idea of what will work. And that helps them build their intuition. They trust their gut feeling. They think, that sounds right in my context. That doesn't sound right in my context. I'm not sure that would work. I think I might need to change that. And then, of course, they have so many resources to share with you, their own knowledge, their experience, their own documents that they use at work, if it's confidential. Yeah, as Lucy said, learners give you the material. It's more accurate and easier for us. And that's really important as well. A lot of us work many hours. We have lots of different clients working in lots of different industries, lots of different roles. It's very difficult if we don't specialize to be experts. Okay. And in essence, this I think is what our learners do. They mediate their professional world for their language trainer. Now, again, if we go back to the CEFR, mediation is vital in communication. So, yeah, NDA, non-disclosure agreements, absolutely. So it depends on the documents they have. They may not be able to, but they may be able to create things which are similar without obviously revealing any of that confidential information. And then, of course, if you know me, if you're someone who maybe follows me on LinkedIn, then you know that I'm a big fan of Dogma ELT. And this is my favorite quote from Thornbury and Medding's book. The content most likely to engage learners and to trigger learning processes is that which is already there, supplied by the people in the room. So I think we can use this dogma approach in our English for professional purposes, English for specific purposes, English for occupational purposes, training. If you're not familiar with dogma, you can find lots of things online, but the basic idea is it's conversation driven, materials light, and you focus on emergent language. That's kind of the key. Okay. And speaking of emergent language, this is something that I came up with a while ago. And it might be useful because if you are doing these activities based on your learners' needs, then we can really focus on their ability to communicate and the language they use. And this is something I call user, which is when we listen to our learners performing in English, we can think about upgrading it. If you're working with groups, they can share it. You can extend it by, is it similar to other items of language? And of course, reformulate. So if you want a simple mnemonic for working with emergent language, user, upgrade, share, extend, and reformulate might be quite helpful. Yeah, great. And looking at some of the comments, Dadini, that's what professionals want. Yeah. Okay, great. So I've talked a lot about needs analysis, and now I'd like to, in the last 10 minutes or so, move to this framework which I created. Now, I'm not suggesting you should use this framework necessarily for designing activities or lessons, but it may give you your own ideas. You may want to try it. I use it now a lot for creating activities which seem spontaneous, but there's actually quite a lot of idea and thought gone beforehand. So let's think of an example of something that happened to me a while ago. Again, with another Italian student, Marco, and he's an head of an IT department. And he had to explain to a client why he missed a deadline. So we had something planned for our meeting. It was a one-to-one. And he said, look, Dylan, in a couple of hours, I've got to explain to this client why I missed a deadline. And so I said, okay, well, we can work on that. And maybe we can do a type of role play or real play based on, what might happen in this interaction to prepare him for it. So we have the what. He was talking about this IT project. We have the who, his client. We have the how, because he told me he was going to have a Teams meeting with this client, so it's oral communication. And then we explored the purpose. So I'd like you now, again in the chat, this is the scenario. Marco has to explain to a client why he missed the deadline. What do you think is the desired outcome or communicative intent or purpose that Marcus has? What does he really want to do? Okay, apologize, right? Yeah, yeah, that was definitely part of it. An extension, absolutely. Soften the blow, pacify the client. Yeah. Okay. In this case, and it might be different for every person, but I think Graham said it, apologize, explain, and justify. Yeah. And resolve, win back trust. He didn't want to lose this client. So there were quite a few different functions going on there. So I said, okay, well, let's use this as the basis for today's lesson. So this was my first step. You need to relate it to the learner's professional life. Contextualize the task to the learner's specific professional need to ensure clarity of purpose. So this is what I did naturally. Asked them to tell me more about the context. Then we discussed the purpose. I asked him, why is this important to you? And that got me the buy-in. So he was like, yeah, that sounds like a really good, useful, practical idea for the lesson. So you relate it to them. Then the next step, I gave him space. I said, well, spend a few minutes, okay? Think about what you would say in this situation, okay? What phrases would you use? So I gave him a couple of minutes of space to make some notes. He could have verbalized that as well. But I wanted to get him thinking about the language already knew. And then I asked him the question, when I asked him to tell me the language, how can I help you with the language? And this is where we did a bit of preliminary work. He maybe wasn't sure how to say a couple of phrases. He wanted to know if this particular verb was appropriate in that situation. So this is the rehearsal. You get them ready, but you have to slow them down. A lot of learners will want to jump straight into the role play, if you like, but it's a good idea, I think, to slow them down, get them retrieving what they already know. And then remember, this is where we respond to the task. So just to refresh the task, it was Marco has to explain to a client why he missed a deadline. And I said, do it as a monologue. Let's have a go. I won't interrupt, but I will take some notes. Don't worry about making mistakes. So I gave him the chance to talk for maybe a minute, 2 minutes, see if he could just produce that language anyway, like he might do, where he would have the floor for maybe a minute or 2 minutes. And then we have the feedback stage. So I provided feedback on his accuracy and clarity. We addressed emergent language needs. I talked about what he did well, what he might like to work on, gave him a few natural phrases. So I was extending and upgrading his language. And this worked really well. Yeah, someone said role playing. That's right. That's why this isn't really a role play. It's just them, their chance to actually give basically a tiny little presentation. The monologue is a very small presentation. Um, I prefer to use real play as well if you can. You don't want to give them necessarily, I want you to be this role. Imagine if you can try to get them to, use their own experience. So we refined, and then of course we must never forget they have to redo it. So this time they repeated the task, integrating the feedback, help with that overall fluency. Let's try again. I won't interrupt. Don't worry, I'll take notes. We can repeat again if necessary, maybe two, three, four, five times. Now, if you've got a group, you could do it as a mingling activity. If you know Paul Nation's idea of 4-3-2, he says, begin by asking them to talk for 4 minutes to a partner. Then they do a different partner, but they try to do it in 3 minutes, and then the same task in 2 minutes. You can sort of adapt that, and you notice that they get more concise and more fluent through repetition. And then after they've redone it and they're quite comfortable with the monologue task, then we reinforce, but this becomes like a dialogue. So this time we might want to do a bit of role playing. And I can say, now I'm going to play the role of the client. I'm going to interrupt, ask questions, and so on. But by this point, the learner is much more confident in what they want to say. So they're able to adapt and feel more comfortable with that more spontaneous, interactive mode of communication. And then again, how did that feel? Would you like to repeat it? I generally give the learners the opportunity to repeat. Okay. Again, you could expand that. But you see how this framework, this 6-stage framework, we can use for many different activities based on what our learner tells us is what they need. So here's the framework in full. Relate, rehearse, respond. That's when they do the monologue task. Refine, that's where the feedback comes in. Redo, repetition. And again, they might want to redo it 2, 3, 4 times. And then finally, reinforces where you make it into an interactive, dialogic activity. You could really expand it. You could have discussions, but still focus on that main task of, I will play the role of the client. And usually, and in my experience, they're much more confident at the end because they've gone through this process from a monologue to a dialogue, from spoken production to spoken interaction. Okay, so that's really what I wanted to build up to. Now, I've created a number of different minimal prep activities using this particular framework. So here are some of them. Some of them are a bit more playful, a bit more imaginative, maybe, but here are some of my ideas. And again, I said I wasn't going to use or mention Chat GPT or AI, but AI can help you create a lot of these tasks as well. It'll give you plenty of ideas. And just one thing, even if you work with groups, you can still do many of these tasks. They'll all have slightly different areas of interest, slightly different topics, slightly different vocabulary areas, but they can still use that functional language with each other. Okay. Framework isn't in a book, although I might create an ebook at some point um, if people like this. So it's nearly time for me to end. So as is customary in these situations, I'd just like to summarize, and maybe again, you could write in the chat box. What do you think? Does this framework based on a needs analysis and then a lesson design framework, Does it help them address their real life needs, allow them to adapt to changing situations? Does it provide them with reasonably authentic practice? Does it foster fluency, accuracy, and clarity development? Does it give them the opportunity to work on spoken production and interaction? And perhaps most importantly, do you think it helps to bridge the gap between their current and their desired performance? So if you want, you can give me a little feedback in the chat. Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, I hope it can be adapted to what other industry sectors. Okay, okay. Um, these are my references. I can pass the slide presentation, the slide deck on to people if you're interested. And I guess I should say this as well. I have a website, which is my name, dylangates.com, and there's plenty of free resources on the website. I'm on LinkedIn a lot, so if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, that's the best place to find me. And I do have a Teach Business English LinkedIn group, which I'm happy for you to join. We have about 890 members, so it would be good to reach 1,000 at some point.
Wow.
Thanks very much for listening. I can stop
Thank,
sharing now if you like.
Thank you, Dylan. Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you. Some really interesting ideas there. I'll let you catch your breath for a second. But yeah, some really interesting bits there. And I think what really struck me was this idea, when we're doing a needs analysis, especially perhaps in the situation you're talking about, it's not just what the students or learners need to be able to do, it's who they're going to be working with, right? And that's that big difference, like you were saying, are these going to be people that speak English at the same level, a higher level, a lower level? Are we moving into this BELF, this lingua franca, and so on? And that's really, really important to know right at the beginning so that you're giving them what they actually need rather than just something out of a textbook that might not be useful to them at all, like a list of idioms, for example, like you said. So it's a really good reminder and something that struck me here.
Absolutely.
We have had some good questions coming in already, and there's some more coming in the Q&A. I just think, just to remind everyone here, we've got questions about the slides. The best thing to do is to follow Dylan on LinkedIn because he shares loads of stuff there. Contact him there, and I'm sure he'll be happy to do something with the slides in that case. But a question for you now. So,
Hmm.
in terms of speaking to your students here and all the things that you're doing with them, how overt or how open are you with about the processes you're going through? Do you explain why you're doing things with them?
Um, Increasingly so, yes. Yeah, at the beginning I didn't do it so much, and then I thought, well, why not? I do work a lot with relatively high level learners as well. So I think it's a lot easier perhaps if you're working with people sort of B2 and above. Um, but yeah, I spend a lot of time talking about sort of metacognition as well. So they're able to reflect on their own learning. And I always sort of I even introduce now the idea of dogma and I say this is how I like to approach my training with you. Do you think it will suit your purposes? And it does depend. Some people say no, it's not really for me. But on the whole, I would say 80% of people now say, yeah, it kind of works for them because they're really interested in that oral communication practice.
Fantastic. Thank you there. And obviously, you've been focusing today a lot on business English here, but we've got people from a wide variety of teaching backgrounds here. So people are asking, do you think there's only overlap here with the kind of processes that you go through and ideas with things, other ESP areas? So we've got people talking about aviation here or even English for academic purposes, EAP.
Yeah, I mean, I think with EAP, it's a little bit different because generally, I mean, I've done quite a lot of EAP work myself, and it does depend, but often they're very, very clear on their goals and they know exactly what they need to do. They might need to give a formal presentation to write essays. So there perhaps isn't so much flexibility in EAP. I might be wrong about that. I don't do that much EAP work. Um, but I think certainly with other forms of ESP, Um, Often you might find you have a course book or a syllabus or materials you have to follow, but I think there's always room within that, especially with the actual practical everyday communication that our learners need, that sometimes we find there are gaps in these materials. So the course book doesn't necessarily include something they really need to do in their daily work. So I think, so much of what we do, there's a great book by Julie Dickerson called Design for How People Learn. And she all says it's all about identifying the gap, and the gaps may not be evident from the stakeholders. So the stakeholder, the human resource manager, or a boss might think that's what the learner needs, but actually it might be quite different.
I see. Thank you. Thank you. A few questions coming in as well, related to Dogme, which I know is one of your other passions and relates to this, and you did mention
Mm.
it. So in terms of being materials light, how do you approach students, or what do you say to students who kind of might be expecting not that approach? They're used to a textbook, they're used to worksheets, they're used to maybe online work. What do you say to them? How do you persuade them to do things slightly differently?
I don't tend to have that issue nowadays, and I think it's because I don't work in language schools anymore. But when I did, then I was always quite lucky because in most language schools I worked at, I was able to say, can we have like a conversation space? Like, if it was a 3 hour lesson, I worked in London for many years. So we had these 3 hour sessions and maybe 2.5 hours using the course book. And then half an hour was something a bit more flexible and conversational. So, I've always been sort of trying to change that a little bit, and I'd rather have 30 minutes of the book and 2.5 hours per conversation, but perhaps that's not going to happen in too many situations. But I think it's like with in many cases, if the feedback's good and you've got to somehow relay that feedback to the people who make decisions.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, to go back a little bit to kind of some of the things you were saying, we've got individual cases there, so maybe in one-to-one situations, and that's quite
Mm.
usual in business because it's very specialized. But we have people that have joined us today, and in some cases, even in a business situation, there will be a small group or even slightly larger groups in some cases. So, in what ways can these ideas apply where the needs will obviously, in some cases, be slightly different, if not quite different within the group?
Absolutely, absolutely. And so the example I had was, he had to explain to a client why he was going to miss a deadline. But we can sort of expand that to we all have to explain about not doing what we committed ourselves to or not being able to do. So we can, I think, extend that to explaining and justifying and apologizing in general. So with that focus on functional language, given them the ability to, whether it's communicative strategies or becoming a bit more comfortable with certain functions, then I think we can apply it to groups as well. So it might be that rather than talk about a specific explaining to a client that you miss a deadline. So have you ever had to explain to someone when you weren't able to do something? It could be a teacher, it could be a parent, it could be a friend. Um, and so I think we have so much in common. And I think even a group which is quite disparate and you've got lots of different people, maybe from different backgrounds, we all need to explain, we all need to justify. So I think we can find a way around that.
So it's using that kind of functional languaging and then putting it onto the context that might be useful for others in the class. And I suppose there's always some negotiation when there's a group about what you're doing and why you're doing it. And that maybe leads to being open with the students as well, of kind of, well, we're looking at this now and next we'll look at this and it will help everyone. So
Exactly, and I've even only done it a couple of times, but with the why, the what, who, how, and why framework, um, I've asked learners to write it down, and then we put them all up on a board, and I've said, okay, now you as a group, you decide which one you'd like to focus on today, and so they kind of negotiate that, and then they come to a decision as a group, and then okay, so today we're going to work on explaining, and that can work quite well.
and I guess if it's a multilingual group or a group that's using English all the time, then they're doing that negotiation, which is more functional language through English as well. So that's
Absolutely,
a good start to the lesson
absolutely.
in lots of ways. Um, a few more minutes for some questions, more questions, which is good. So, looking at this in two brackets, actually. So, a couple of people have asked, how do these ideas work when the level of proficiency is quite low with the students? So we've got people asking, would it work with A2 or low B1 students? And I suppose related to that, and that especially comes to your framework of kind of what, who, etc. If they are new to their job, new to their position, or maybe they haven't even started their position yet, they're doing this as a kind of before they take on a new role. How do you work with that? So the lower levels
Mm,
of proficiency and the low level of, say, content knowledge, if you like.
mm. Yeah, I think with content knowledge, now so much stuff is available out there. So it might be a case of going to a website and you make an educated guess about what they might need in that particular role. Um, Another thing now, I think, even if they've got a low level, then they can perhaps translate their ideas. So, they work out what they might need to do if they're a Spanish speaker. So they write it in Spanish, they translate it, and then they can give it to me. So they're mediating that. And then we can look at that together and think, okay, it seems to me like this is what you want. So I don't necessarily think it's so much of a problem. Even at fairly low levels, A2 you kind of still need to explain, for example. So yeah,
Yeah,
bridging exercises someone's put there. So
absolutely. Yeah. And I suppose with, again, we've got a very international group with us here, so there will be multilingual teachers here as well. And in some cases, you can have that discussion in the languages that are known by the students there, and then sort of make a plan for what's going on. So there's room for that translanguaging, we might call it, to
absolutely.
happen in the planning and perhaps even in the teaching of it sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, as I said, because I work a lot with high level learners, that isn't so much of an issue. But yeah, if you are working with the lower level learners, then translanguaging, yes, use whatever works.
That's true, yes. There's also a question here about, you mentioned that you kind of do a regular check-in with your student or students, depending on the context. So in terms of providing a longer term plan, and that can be an issue, say, in a business situation where perhaps the student isn't paying for the lesson. We have to
Mm,
talk financials here sometimes.
yeah.
So there might be someone else that's looking for a longer term plan, what's going to happen in the next 2 months, 6 months. So how do you make that balance between the longer term plan and kind of those check-ins and maybe making changes to that plan?
Absolutely. I mean, that's a big issue, I think, with any sort of business English or English for professional purposes context, that the stakeholders are there, and it could be departmental heads or human resources managers. So I honestly, that's where we have to be in contact with these people, if we can. But generally, if in a lot of situations, it really does depend, but there will be some contact with the people who are paying for the courses. So as long as you've got that contact name, then I think it makes sense to get in touch with them, actually say to them, this is what I think this person needs, this employee needs. What do you think? Does it fit in with what you like? I've tried that on a couple of occasions and it's worked. Doesn't mean it will always work, but
Like you said before, I guess nothing works for everyone in some cases.
yeah.
But I think that's quite interesting in some ways to just to move to another, it's a big jump, but sort of thinking about the young learner classroom in a way. I mean, I'm
Mm,
not with all of these things, but there's always the stakeholder of the parents there as well, and
yeah,
negotiating with them like this is what we're doing in class, and this is what the longer term plan is, and
yeah.
it's kind of it's equivalent to that to a certain extent, I suppose.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. But I mean, I think most parents, um, they might be focused on grammar, for example, but they want to know that their kids can speak and communicate. Most parents get incredibly proud if their kids have a 2 minute conversation in English. So I think we can always, even with the parents, we can remind them. I'm also going to work on their fluency skills, their accuracy skills, and helping them become a clear speaker. So I think you can sell that to the parents in most cases as well.
Absolutely. And I suppose to go back to business, and I'm going to use an idiom here, but the proof is in the pudding in some ways, in where the student actually feels more confident in their surroundings. They're able to do the things that you've listed out more confidently. They're understanding more. And I suppose if you can get that feedback going to you, but then also to whoever might be paying, so whether that's HR or whoever is going, that's very satisfying for everyone involved, all stakeholders. It's funny when we talk business English, we start using business terms like stakeholders and so on, isn't it? It's unavoidable.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
I only ever use that in a steakhouse.
on that badly punned ending, I think we will stop for today. But it leaves me to say thank you very much to everyone who joined us today. It's been a very active chat box, which is great. Remembering that you will receive a record of attendance within a week or 10 days or so. That will be automatic. And as Dylan has said, and I've said a couple of times, do follow him on LinkedIn. He's very, very active and shares all sorts of amazing top tips, experiences, ideas, and gets very interesting conversations going as well. And have a look at his website. There's some great stuff there too. And of course, the biggest thanks today goes to you, Dylan, for joining us and presenting these wonderful ideas. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your mornings, afternoons, evenings, everyone. And I'll see you next time. And goodbye to Dylan.
Great. Thank you very much, everyone. And thanks for your great insights and comments in the chat. If anyone does want a copy of the slides, yeah, if you just get in touch with me on LinkedIn, that's probably the best way then. I could put them in here if you want, but
We'll do LinkedIn. That will work
LinkedIn, I
better.
think, is
I
probably
think
better.
that will
Yeah.
be.
Okay.
And they'll follow you and learn more.
Okay, great.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks for joining
Thanks,
and
everyone.
see you next month. Bye bye.
Bye bye.